Hello and welcome back. This is Arran at the Battle of Prestonpans Museum in East Lothian, Scotland, with the latest update of our ongoing real-time interactive wargame campaign. So, as usual, the Jacobite decisions have been made by Facebook polls, and a closed group of redcoat reenactors have been determining what the British Army should get up to as well. Let's see what's happened in the first 2 weeks of November, and pretty important those 2 weeks have turned out to be. So if we remind ourselves, at the end of our last vlog, we had the Jacobite army of Charles Edward Stuart laying siege to Stirling Castle. We got a smaller force of lowland troops led by Lord Lewis Gordon making its way down the east coast from Aberdeen, and he'd got a force led by the Marquis of Tullibardine at Glasgow, fresh from a success over the Duke of Argyll's attempts to raise militia in the west. But we also had Marshal Wade, who'd gathered a considerable force and marched it north to Newcastle, where it had linked up with the garrison of General Husk. Now, Marshal Wade had a number of options once he was consolidated at Newcastle, but he decided not to separate any of his men from the field army to create a garrison for that city, and not to send reinforcements across to the tiny little garrison of invalids at Carlisle. Instead, he kept all of his available manpower together as a field army. The really quite important exception, though, was that he decided to separate his cavalry out from his main force of infantry and guns. He sent the cavalry over to Hexham, from which, if they needed to, they could make a quick dash towards Carlisle if the Jacobites made a thrust in that direction, and the dragoons would be able to dismount and help the men on the walls, holding enough time, hopefully, for Wade's main force to come through if they needed to. So the cavalry at Hexham needed a commander, and the unexpected decision perhaps was to bring back General Sir John Cope, who'd been defeated at Prestonpans with two of these same regiments. In fact, he came over and took command of that cavalry brigade at Hexham, and perhaps give himself an opportunity to redeem his reputation. But rather than sitting passively and letting the Jacobites continue their siege of Stirling Castle without any concerns, Marshal Wade decided that he was going to go on to the offensive, and the whole British field army moved north towards the border. Cope and the cavalry brigade marched in parallel on the inland route, whilst Wade and the infantry went up the coastal route from which they could be supplied by sea, a much better road for the guns as well. In response, the Jacobites pulled all of their forces together. Gordon had already arrived at Stirling, but they also pulled in Marquis of Tullibardine and his recently victorious forces from Glasgow. The Jacobites had consolidated their strength at Stirling. The question now was whether they would wait for Wade to come to them, or whether they would march on him. After a lot of deliberations, the Jacobites decided that they were going to detach a flying column that would march out and deal not with Wade's main army, but with the cavalry brigade of Sir John Cope. The idea was to deny Cope his strength of horse, weaken his position, and potentially slow down his advance towards Edinburgh and Stirling. This left the main field army able to prosecute the siege, which, now into its third week, might soon conclude. Unfortunately, the Marquis of Tullibardine, hero of 9 Mile Bridge and the battle at Glasgow, he'd taken sick, and so the prince decided not to ask of any further exhaustive exertions from him. And rather, a division was attached under Lord George Murray, and this was a mixed force of cavalry and clansmen, and it was sent off through Edinburgh to intercept Johnny Cope's advance. Lord George Murray's instructions were to try and get as far as Lauder, because if he could get there, he could essentially cut the road eastwards between Wade and Cope's approach, and therefore force Cope to fight. The Jacobites were confident they'd taken enough men to be able to absorb the impact of Cope's superior cavalry. Now, Cope managed to get to Lauder before the Jacobite force did, but only just, and he received word that his cavalry outriders had seen Jacobite mounted scouts ahead on the road. He sent back for orders. There was a decision taken, and he was instructed to push forwards and see if he could break through against the unknown size of Jacobite force ahead of him. And so, at Soutra Hill, the battle took place between Sir John Cope and Lord George Murray and their two respective forces. As always, we then turn to Roy's military survey of Scotland from about 10 years after the campaign took place, and this gives us our landscape for the day. Now, running through the middle of this open rising moorland is the old Roman road, Deer Street, and it's up this that Sir John Cope would have been approaching from Lauder. In the opposite direction, coming down from Dalkeith, comes Lord George Murray, and really the only settled feature on the landscape is the remains of the old former medieval hospital at Soutra. So a simple open battlefield, perhaps the ideal landscape for a cavalry engagement. So Lord George Murray arrived on the battlefield first, and although the enemy know that he's coming, he was able to deploy, getting his infantry into position in front of Soutra Hospital and throwing his cavalry out onto the flank. Murray knew he needed to bring infantry with him because the Jacobite cavalry were relatively small units and yet to face the fire of battle. So he brought with him Cameron of Locheil's veteran Highlanders, a battalion from his own Athol Brigade, and the Duke of Perth's regiment in support as well. Now, these were good regiments, and hopefully they would not be exposed to destruction beneath the hooves of charging British cavalry. To their right, 4 small Jacobite cavalry squadrons, Pitsligo's, Strathallan's, Elcho's Lifeguards, and Bagot's Hussars. All small units, able to fire from the saddle at relatively close range, but relying on each other for mutual support, because none on their own will be able to engage a full regiment of enemy dragoons or horse. Now, General Cope couldn't miss the enemy, formed up as they were on the high ground near the hospital, and so he brought his 4 regiments of dragoons and horse onto the field. He had the 13th Dragoons and the 14th Dragoons. They are the regiments that had been at Prestonpans with him, men who have already shown that they've got a little bit to prove. He also has the Northumberland Militia Horse, an untested militia unit, and, most importantly, a regiment of Dutch regulars, who hopefully will be able to carve a path through the Highland ranks. Cope chose to peel his men off the road and form in lines facing the Jacobite cavalry, hoping that he'd be able to deal with that in the open ground relatively swiftly. He deployed with 2 regiments abreast and 2 in support to the rear. And then, when they were in position, they made a general advance. Cope's cavalry made a noble sight, moving across the open moorland towards the rising ground. The Jacobite horse didn't initially come forwards to engage, but the Jacobite infantry did begin to redeploy so that they could threaten the flank of the advancing blocks of horsemen. As the cavalry advanced steadily, the Jacobites opened fire. In hindsight, this opening volley is one of the most important moves in the entire engagement, because the withering fire that comes in from the Athol Brigade is sufficient to disorder the advance of the Dutch regular horse, the heaviest cavalry unit on the field, and thrown into disorder, they're no longer able to continue their advance. Seeing the disorder on the British Army's right, Bagot's Hussars take heart, and when the Northumberland militia advance and charge, they too countercharge. Despite the disparity in numbers, the militia horse are driven back in some disorder. So Cope's advance has already hit a very significant setback. The Dutch heavy horse have been forced to a standstill, and the militia horse have been driven back. Then Bagot's Hussars, with their blood up and inspired by their success so far, decide they're going to try and push their luck, and they have a sweeping advance through the wreckage of the Northumbrian horse into Ligonier's 13th Dragoons, formerly Colonel Gardner's men who'd fought at Prestonpans. He has the support of Pitsligo's behind him. In the centre of the battlefield, the advance of Hamilton's dragoons through the Dutch as they reform has smashed into Strathallan's horse, who are supported by Elcho's Lifeguards, and it is the support that proves to be crucial in the coming cavalry battle. Bagot's Hussars have actually done a pretty remarkable job, not only smashing through the Northumberland militia, but then pinning Ligoniers in place so that they can't play any role in supporting other elements of the British cavalry. But it comes at a cost, and Baggots are eventually driven back by Ligonier's men. Only for Pitsligo's horse in their rear to stop Ligonier's advance and in due course drive his regiment off, and they, shaken, fall back with the remnants of the militia and gather on the far side of the adjacent stream. Meanwhile, the Jacobite infantry have managed to advance around the flank of the Dutch, and pouring volleys into them have again disordered them, ensuring that that important heavy cavalry regiment cannot engage in the rest of the fight. That leaves Hamilton's dragoons vulnerable and alone on the front line and engaged by Strathallan's horse, supported by Lord Elcho's lifeguards. Eventually, after a bruising combat, they break, pouring through past Sir John Cope and the remaining Dutch. The flight of the dragoons is a critical moment here, and it seems that unless that heavy cavalry unit can get into action quickly, Johnny Cope's brigade is virtually lost. The Jacobites know this, and they're still fearful of the power of that Dutch horse unit, and so they decide to take the initiative and charge in themselves. Strathallans lead the way, smashing into the superior size and power of the Dutch, supported though by a rapid charge from Clancameron, who charge into the flank of the Dutch unit. Despite this difficult-looking position, however, the Dutch are successful at driving back both the Camerons on their flank and Strathallans to their fore. It was an heroic stand, and they have at last made an impact on the battlefield. But the Dutch success in surviving the Jacobite attack was only partial. They drove the enemy back, but they did not break them. And now they were sat in the open moor, exposed to withering Jacobite volleys from a number of angles. The casualties were simply too much for them to bear, and the Dutch regulars broke and fled the field. Johnny Cope was only able to ride over to the shaken remnants of the Northumbrian horse and Ligonier's dragoons, and with them he opted to withdraw from the field and make his way back to Lauder, and thence across the country towards Marshal Wade and his army that was still advancing up the east coast route towards Edinburgh. A Jacobite victory, a significant one, because although several Jacobite units had taken heavy casualties and been driven back, none of them had been broken, and the Jacobites had successfully stalled the inland wing of Marshal Wade's advance. So if we return to the campaign map, General Cope manages to escape, suffering desertion along the way, with now just 2 small cavalry regiments back to join Marshal Wade, who at this point has reached the coastal town of Dunbar. He's now worried that Lord George Murray potentially offers a threat to his own flank and might even cut his supply lines by curling round towards Berwick and closing the road to Newcastle. Marshal Wade now has a lot to think about. And then, just 2 days after the engagement in the borders, the news comes to Dunbar that Stirling Castle has fallen. After a siege of around 27 days, Stirling Castle has finally fallen to the Jacobites, not because they breached and assaulted it, but simply because the small garrison ran out of supplies. Now the Jacobite army is potentially freed up to do a number of things. So far from his advance startling the Jacobites to abandon the siege of Stirling, Marshal Wade now finds himself inside Scotland and on the defensive. Fearing the Jacobite strength will now come against him in the east, he's ordered his men to entrench at Dunbar whilst he works out what's best to do next. He's asked to be supplied with food by sea from Newcastle, but the seas themselves are becoming contested, for the French have finally confirmed they've sent a force under Lord John Drummond that will land in Scotland within the next few days. How large it is, we don't know. But the important thing is it's a double blow for Marshal Wade, for when they arrive, not only will the Jacobite army be stronger, but Wade's army will be weaker, because it will oblige him to send home the Dutch regiments, who, due to a former parole during the War of the Austrian Succession, will not be able to fight against an army containing French units. Wade is therefore looking a little bit vulnerable. But by no means do the Jacobites only have the option of marching towards an immediate battle. They could decide that now's the time to thrust towards the border. They have Stirling and Edinburgh in their hands, nobody to oppose them in northern Scotland. Newcastle and Carlisle are both pretty much without garrisons, and if they strike down towards the border, they should be able to have the time and the space to take one or other of those fortresses and take the war into England. If they do that, then they will be able to link up with their friends in England and perhaps begin recruiting there, as well as in Scotland, and extend their influence. It might also be just the trigger the French need to start sending serious levels of help. But it's not all straightforward for the Jacobites from here, because after all of this time that they've spent consolidating in Scotland, not only had Wade's army grown, but the Duke of Cumberland himself, the son of George II, has been gathering veteran regiments from the continent down in the south of England. He's now completed his field army, brought all of his strength over, and could potentially march up to challenge any Jacobite thrust either towards the east or the west of England. So some pretty critical decisions to be made in this next phase of the campaign. So as we go into mid-November, the Jacobites have never looked stronger, but their phase of consolidation is surely over. Now is the time to move the war towards some form of climax. They have to either face Wade or get past him and take the war into England if they're ever to reach their long-term objective of putting James Stuart onto the throne in London. Lots more to come. Let's see what happens next. As ever, thanks for watching.